Last time, we explored an uncomfortable idea that if you do not consciously own your perspective, someone else will gladly provide one for you. Not necessarily because they are evil, not necessarily because they are plotting against you, but because every person, every institution, every movement, every system is constantly communicating a way of seeing the world. Today, I want to take that conversation deeper, because once you understand that perspective matters, the next question becomes obvious. Where do perspectives come from? How are they formed? How does a human being arrive at the conclusions they call their own? Most people assume perspectives are the result of independent thinking. That sounds nice. It sounds empowering. It sounds intelligent. But it is only partially true. The reality is more complicated. Long before you developed critical thinking, your perspective was already being shaped. Before you learned to question, before you learned to analyze, before you learned to challenge assumptions, the construction had already begun. Think about a child. A child arrives in the world asking questions, not carrying answers. Everything is new. Everything is being interpreted for the first time. And because they lack experience, they naturally borrow interpretations from the people around them. This is normal. In fact, it is necessary. A child learns what is dangerous, what is acceptable, what is admirable, what is shameful, what is possible, what is impossible. Not through independent investigation, but through observation and absorption. The first perspectives we inherit are usually not chosen, they are received. Family gives us a lens, culture gives us a lens, religion gives us a lens, community gives us a lens, school gives us a lens, life experiences give us a lens. Then something fascinating happens. The lens becomes invisible. We stop seeing it, we only see through it. And the moment a lens becomes invisible, it becomes powerful. Imagine wearing tinted glasses every day for 20 years. Eventually, you stop noticing the color. You assume the world itself looks that way. That is what happens with perspective. We become so familiar with our way of seeing that we make it for reality itself. This is why two intelligent people can look at the same situation and arrive at completely different conclusions. Not because one is necessarily stupid, not because one is necessarily dishonest, but because each person is seen through a different lens. The problem begins when people forget they are looking through a lens at all. Because once that happens, every disagreement starts looking like ignorance. Every challenge feels like an attack. Every alternative perspective feels threatening. And growth becomes difficult. Now, here is where perspective manufacturing becomes interesting. Most people imagine manipulation as something dramatic. A powerful person standing on a stage telling everyone what to think. But that is rarely how it works. The most effective influence is often subtle, quiet, repeated, ordinary. The most powerful perspectives are rarely forced upon people. They are normalized. Think about that word, normalized. What feels normal eventually feels true. What feels familiar eventually feels trustworthy. What is repeated often enough begins to sound obvious. And once something sounds obvious, most people stop examining it. This is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Repetition. not because repetition creates truth, but because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity creates comfort. Comfort creates acceptance. Acceptance creates belief. Many of the strongest opinions people hold today were not carefully researched. They were repeatedly encountered again and again through conversations, through entertainment, through social media, through news, through culture, through everyday interactions, until they became part of the mental furniture, never examined, just present. That should make us pause. Because if repetition can shape belief, then we need to pay attention to what we repeatedly expose ourselves to. Not because every influence is harmful, but because every influence is shaping something. Let's talk about another force that manufactures perspective: emotion. This one is powerful because human beings like to believe they are rational creatures. The evidence suggests otherwise. We are often emotional creatures who later create rational explanations. A perspective attached to strong emotion becomes extremely difficult to question. Fear can do it, anger can do it, pride can do it, belonging can do it, pain can do it. Once emotion becomes attached to an idea, the idea starts feeling personal. And the moment an idea feels personal, objectivity becomes harder. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to have a calm conversation with someone when their identity is attached to the topic? The discussion stops being about facts. It becomes about protection of identity, protection of belonging, protection of self-image. And suddenly, the goal is no longer understanding. The goal becomes defending. This is one of the reasons perspective ownership requires courage. Because eventually, you will have to question ideas that have become emotionally comfortable. You will have to examine beliefs that helped you make sense of the world. You will have to investigate assumptions that feel familiar. That is not easy, but it is necessary. Now, let's talk about something even more powerful: rewards. Human beings move toward rewards. We always have, we always will. And one of the fastest ways to shape perspective is to reward certain ways of thinking. Every group does this. Families do it. Organizations do it. Communities do it. Political movements do it. Religious groups do it. Corporations do it. Social media certainly does it. Certain opinions are rewarded. Others are discouraged. Certain beliefs receive applause. Others receive criticism. And over time, people learn something. Not necessarily what is true, but what is rewarded. That distinction matters. Very few people consciously ask, do I believe this because it is true? Or do I believe this because it is socially profitable? That question can be uncomfortable, but it is important. Because social acceptance is one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior. Many people would rather be accepted than accurate, not because they are bad people, because they are human. The desire to belong is powerful, which brings us to another perspective manufacturer: tribes. Human beings naturally form groups. We always have families, communities, movements, parties, nations, religions, industries, teams. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The problem begins when loyalty replaces curiosity. Because once belonging becomes the highest value, questioning becomes dangerous. And when questioning becomes dangerous, perspective becomes rigid. One of the most fascinating things in human history is how often intelligent people have defended bad ideas simply because those ideas belonged to their tribe, not because they examined them, not because they proved them, because they inherited them. An inheritance often feels safer than investigation, but growth requires investigation. Now, let's go even deeper. One of the most overlooked perspective manufacturers is personal experience. Many people assume experience automatically produces wisdom. Not always. Experience produces data. Perspective determines interpretation. Two people can experience the same setback. One becomes wiser, the other becomes bitter. Same event, different interpretation. A person gets betrayed. One concludes, I need stronger boundaries. Another concludes, nobody can be trusted. The event is similar. The perspective is different. And that perspective shapes future decisions. This is why painful experiences deserve examination, not because the pain wasn't real, because the conclusions we draw from pain often become permanent lenses. And lenses built in pain can quietly shape an entire life. Some people experience rejection once and spend decades interpreting every interaction through that lens. Others experienced failure once and spent years avoiding risk. The event ended long ago. The perspective remained. Now, let's talk about something that has become increasingly important: algorithms. For most of human history, influence was limited by geography. Today it isn't. Technology has changed that. Many people believe they are freely exploring information online. What they often fail to realize is that information is increasingly being selected for them, not necessarily by people, often by systems. Systems designed to maximize engagement, systems designed to hold attention, systems designed to keep you watching. And these systems learn something very quickly. What captures your emotions? What triggers your reactions? What keeps you engaged? Then they give you more of it, and more, and more, until eventually you can find yourself living inside a carefully reinforced perspective without ever noticing the walls. The danger is not simply misinformation. The danger is narrowing. The danger is becoming increasingly convinced that your perspective is the only reasonable one, because competing perspectives rarely reach you anymore. You stop encountering challenge. You stop encountering complexity. You stop encountering contradiction. And without contradiction, perspective becomes fragile. A perspective that cannot survive examination is not strength, it is dependence. Strong perspectives welcome investigation. Weak perspectives fear it. Now, I want to be careful here. The answer is not to become cynical. The answer is not to reject everything. The answer is not endless skepticism. Some people hear conversations like this and conclude that nothing can be trusted. That is not wisdom. Wisdom is not refusing every perspective. Wisdom is understanding how perspectives are formed. Wisdom is recognizing influence without surrendering to it. Wisdom is remaining teachable without becoming gullible. Wisdom is staying open without becoming naive. And that balance matters because the goal is not independence from all influence. That is impossible. The goal is conscious participation. The goal is awareness. The goal is ownership. To be able to say, I understand where this perspective came from. I understand what shaped it. I understand why it appeals to me. I understand what assumptions support it. And I have examined it honestly. That is very different from simply inheriting a perspective. And that brings us to the most important idea in this entire episode. Most people think freedom is the ability to do whatever they want. But there's another kind of freedom. The freedom to see clearly. The freedom to recognize influence. The freedom to question assumptions. The freedom to examine inherited beliefs. The freedom to investigate your own thinking. The freedom to ask, why do I see the world this way? Because until that question is asked, ownership remains impossible. And without ownership, perspective becomes something that happens to you rather than something you consciously develop. So before we finish, I want to leave you with a challenge. For the next week, pay attention to moments when you immediately agree with something, not moments you disagree. Moments you instantly agree. Those moments are often more revealing. When something feels obviously true, stop and ask, why does this feel obvious? Where did I learn this? Who benefits from this belief? What assumptions support it? What would someone who disagrees say? Not because you must abandon the belief, because examination creates ownership, and ownership creates clarity. In the next episode, we're going somewhere deeper still. We are going to explore the prison you cannot see, the invisible cage built from assumptions, interpretations, and unquestioned narratives. Because sometimes the greatest limitation in a person's life is not their circumstances. It is the perspective through which they view those circumstances. And until that changes, everything else remains surprisingly difficult to change. See you soon.